And good evening once again, everyone. Welcome to We Are the Builders live study group. And I hope everyone is well tonight. I also to just like to acknowledge that we are broadcasting from Silent Land. I'm currently on the land of the Jar Jar Wurrung. I'd like to acknowledge the original people and the elders of the past, present, and future. Acknowledge that their struggle was a struggle against invasion, but obviously now it's a struggle for their own self-determination and against imperialism as well. And right, we've got Jay Thurapple and Joe Montero. Right, Joe, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Very good, very good. Jay, how's things?
Good, good. Worried about the events in Ukraine, but other than
Yes,
that, I'm feeling good.
yes. I think we all got
Yeah,
this.
I actually wrote something on that the other day. I think it was yesterday, and I've gotten a bit of strife already. So
Yeah. Well, look,
and a
let's
few
hope
people that
that
almost
let's
yeah.
hope they can develop this back through diplomacy again and peace. I think because peace is a working class issue, and it's war is just yeah, people will suffer
Absolutely.
from it. That was yes. So
Well,
hopefully
there
this.
was one fellow this afternoon. He's sort of ranting and raving. God, look, he couldn't even put a sentence together, but he finished up. And I suppose you're cheering Chinese troops on Australian soil. I don't know. We got that one wrong.
I don't know where you got that.
Getting a bit carried away.
And speaking of China, just we are now continuing on our study of New Democracy by Chairman Mao Zedong. We are on chapter 10. We'll look to try and get to the next two chapters. They look fairly short, but if we have enough time, we might be able to tackle chapter 12 as well. Word to believe. And then what I was going to suggest we do, we pretty much read a page each. And I think when we finish the chapter, we can have a discussion and do the next one, have some formal discussion. And for those of you who will be viewing this very soon or are currently viewing it, feel free to share this page. Please share this. Please like the page. And also, too, feel free to make any comments or questions that we might be able to address as well. So, Joe, I'll get you to kick it off first. We're on
Okay.
chapter the three people's principles, old and new.
That's it. The bourgeois diehards have no understanding whatsoever of historical change. Their knowledge is so poor that it is practically non existence. They do not know the difference either between communism and the three people's principles or between the new three people's principles and the old. We communists recognize the three people's principles as the political basis of the anti Japanese National United Front. We acknowledge that the three people's principle being what China needs today. Our party is ready to fight for their complete realization. And we admit the basic agreement between the Communist Minimum Program and the political tenets of the three people's principles. But which kind of three people's principles? The three people's principles, as reinterpreted by Dr. Sun Yat sen in the manifesto of the National Congress of the Kuomintang, and no other. I wish the die-hard gentleman would spare a moment from the work of restricting communism, corroding communism, and combating communism, in which they are so gleefully engaged, to glance through this manifesto. In the manifesto, Dr. Sun Yat sen said, "Here is the true interpretation of the Kuomintang's three people's principles. Hence, these are the only genuine three people's principles, and all others are spurious. The only true interpretation of the three people's principles is the one contained in the manifesto of the First National Congress of the Kuomintang, and all other interpretations are false. Presumably, this is no communist fabrication, for many Kuomintang members and I myself personally witnessed the adoption of the manifesto. The manifesto marks off the two epochs in the history of the three people's principles. Before it, they belonged to the old category. They were the three people's principles of the old bourgeois democratic revolution in a semi colony. the three people's principles of old democracy, the old three people's principles. After it, they came with a new category. They became the three people's principles of the new bourgeois democratic revolution in a semi-colony. The three people's principles of new democracy is the new three people's principle. These alone are the revolutionary three people's principles of the new period. The revolutionary three people's principles of the new period is the new genuine three people's principles, embody the great policies of alliance with Russia, cooperation with the Communist Party, and assistance to the peasants and workers. Without each and every one of these three great policies, the three people's principles become.
I think we've lost Joe.
Yeah, she's frozen there for a sec. He's just finishing off with the three principles became either forced or incomplete in a new period.
Yeah, just wait for him, I guess. But
Yeah.
or
Wait.
yep.
Yeah. Or otherwise, yeah, if you want to continue. If he jumps back on board, yeah, we'll just let him know.
Okay, I might just start from the previous paragraph. So, the revolutionary three people's principles of the new period, the new or genuine three people's principles, embody the three great policies of alliance with Russia, cooperation with the Communist Party, and assistance to the peasants and workers. Without each and every one of these three great policies, the three people's principles become either false or incomplete in the new period. In the first place, the revolutionary, new, or genuine three people's principles must include alliance with Russia. As things are today, it is perfectly clear that unless there is a policy of alliance with Russia, with the land of socialism, there will inevitably be a policy of imperialism with the. Is this not exactly what happened after 1927? Once the conflict between the Socialist Soviet Union and the imperialist powers grows sharper, China will have to take her stand on one side or the other. This is an inevitable trend. It is possible to avoid, sorry, is it possible to avoid leaning to either side? No, that is an illusion. The whole world will be swept into one or the other of these two fronts, and neutrality will then be merely a deceptive term. Especially is this true of China, which, fighting an imperialist power that has penetrated deep into her territory, cannot conceive of ultimate victory without the assistance of the Soviet Union. If alliance with China is sacrificed for the sake of alliance with imperialism, the word revolutionary will have to be expunged from the three people's principles, which will then become reactionary. In the last analysis, there can be no neutral three people's principles. They can only be either revolutionary or counter revolutionary. Would it not be more heroic to fight against attacks from both sides, as Wang Qingwei once remarked, and to have the kind of three people's principles that serves this fight? Unfortunately, even its inventor Wang Qingwei himself has abandoned or folded up this kind of three people's principles, for he has adopted the three people's principles of alliance with imperialism. If it is argued that there is a difference between Eastern and Western imperialism, and that unlike Wang Qingwei, who has allied himself with Eastern imperialism, one should ally oneself with some of the Western imperialists to march eastward and attack, then would not such conduct be quite revolutionary? However, whether you like it or not, the Western imperialists are determined to oppose the Soviet Union and communism, and if you ally yourself with them, they will ask you to march northward and attack, and your revolution will come to nothing. All these circumstances make it essential for the revolutionary, new, and genuine three people's principles to include alliance with Russia, and under no circumstances, alliance with imperialism against Russia. Well, that sounds quite relevant to the
Yeah,
present
yes.
day.
Yeah.
It certainly does. My apologies for, but
Yeah.
somehow I fell out of the thing, so I'm
That's
back now.
all right. Look, I'll continue on because in the
Yeah,
second place,
could I just say, because I missed the conversation, just very quickly, because Joe said relevance of today. I think we've got two countries. I think if we're going to counter the new offensive of imperialism, right now, there needs to be a global united front around that. And I think, we've got Russia, China, and a few other countries are really critical, really at the spearhead of that united front. And to take a neutral position is objectively to side with the US, and right at the moment with Russia to actually side with Germany and France.
Mm. All right, well, I'll continue. In the second place, the revolutionary new and genuine three people's principles must include cooperation with the Communist Party. Either you cooperate with the Communist Party or you oppose it. Opposition to communism is the policy of the Japanese imperialists and Wang Qingwei. And if that is what you want, very well. They will invite you to join their anti-communist company. But wouldn't that look suspiciously like turning traitor? You may say, I am not following Japan, but some other country. That is just ridiculous. No matter whom you follow, the moment you oppose the Communist Party, you become a traitor because you can no longer resist Japan. If you say, I am going to oppose the Communist Party independently, that is arrant nonsense. How can heroes in a colony or semi colony tackle a counter revolutionary job of this magnitude without depending on the strength of imperialism? For 10 long years, virtually all the imperialist forces in the world were enlisted against the Communist Party, but in vain. How can you suddenly oppose it independently? Some people outside the border region, uh, we are told, are now saying opposing the Communist Party is good, but you can never succeed in it. This remark is not simply hearsay, is only half wrong. For that, what's good is there in opposing the Communist Party, but the other half is true. You certainly can never succeed in it. Basically, the reason lies not with the communists, but with the common people who like the Communist Party and do not like opposing it. If you oppose the Communist Party as a juncture when a national enemy is penetrating deep into our territory, the people will be after your hide. They will certainly show you no mercy. This this much is certain. Whoever wants to oppose the Communist Party must be prepared to be ground to dust. If you're not keen on being ground to dust, you had certainly better drop this opposition. This is our sincere advice to all the anti-communist heroes. That it is as clear as can be that the three people's principles of today must include cooperation with the Communist Party, or otherwise those principles will perish. It is a question of life and death of the three people's principles. Cooperating with the Communist Party, they will survive. Opposing the Communist Party, they will perish. Can anyone prove the contrary? Joe.
In the third place, the revolutionary new and genuine three people's principles must include the policy of assisting the peasants and workers. Rejection of this policy, failure wholeheartedly to assist the peasants and workers, or failure to carry out the behest in Dr. Sun Yat sen's testament to arouse the masses of the people, end quote, amounts to preparing the way for the defeat of the revolution and one's own defeat into the bargain. Stalin has said that, in essence, quote, in essence, the national question is a peasant question, end quote. This means that the Chinese Revolution is essentially a peasant revolution and that the resistance to Japan now going on is essentially peasant resistance. Essentially, the politics of New Democracy means giving the peasants their rights. The new and genuine three people's principles are essentially the principles of a peasant revolution. Essentially, mass culture means raising the cultural level of the peasants. The anti Japanese war is essentially a peasant war. We are now living in a time when when the quote principle of going up into the hills end quote applies. Meetings, work, classes, newspaper publication, the writing of books, theatrical performances, everything is done up in the hills, and all essentially for the sake of the peasants. And essentially, it is the peasants who provide everything that sustains the resistance to Japan and keeps us going. By essentially, we mean basically not ignoring the other sections of the people, as Stalin himself has explained. As every schoolboy knows, 80% of China's population are peasants. So the peasant problem becomes the basic problem of the Chinese Revolution, and the strength of the peasants is the main strength of the Chinese Revolution. In the Chinese population, the workers rank second to the peasants in number. There are several million industrial workers in China and several tens of millions of handicraft workers and agricultural laborers. China cannot live without her workers in the various industries because they are the producers in the industrial sectors of the economy. And the revolution cannot succeed without the modern industrial working class because it is the leader of the Chinese revolution and is the most revolutionary class. In these circumstances, the revolutionary new and genuine Three People's Principles must include the policy of assisting the peasants and workers. Any other kind of Three People's Principles which lack this policy do not give the peasants and workers wholehearted assistance or do not carry out the behest to, quote, arouse the masses of the people will certainly perish. Over to you, Joe.
Okay. Thus, it is clear that there is no future for any Three People's Principles, which depart from the three great policies of alliance with Russia, cooperation with the Communist Party, and assistance to the peasants and workers. Every conscientious follower of the three principles must seriously consider this point. The Three People's Principles, comprising of the three great policies, in other words, the revolutionary, the new and genuine Three People's Principles, are the Three People's Principles of New Democracy, a development of the old Three People's Principles, a great contribution of Dr. Sun Yat-sen's, and a product of the era in which the Chinese Revolution has become part of the World Socialist Revolution. It is only these three people's principles which the Chinese Communist Party regards as being what China needs today, and for those complete and for whose complete realization it declares itself pledged to fight. These are the only three people's principles, which are in basic agreement with the Communist Party's political program for the stage of democratic revolutionary, namely with its minimum program. For the old three people's principles, there were a product. As the old three people's principles, they were a product of the old period of Chinese revolution. Russia was then an imperialist power, and naturally there could be no policy of alliance with her. There was then no communist party in existence in our country, and naturally there could be no policy of cooperation with it. The movement of the workers and peasants had not yet revealed its full political significance and aroused people's attention, and naturally there could be no policy of alliance with them. Hence, the three people's principles of the period before the reorganisation of the Kuomintang in 1924 belonged to the old category, and they became obsolete. The Kuomintang could not have gone forward unless it had developed them into new three people's principles. Dr. Sun Yat-sen, in his wisdom, saw this point, secured the help of the Soviet Union and the Chinese Communist Party, and reinterpreted the three people's principles so as to endow them with new characteristics suited to the times. As a result, the United Front was formed between the three people's principles and communism. Kuomintang communist cooperation was established for the first time. The sympathy of the people of the whole country was won, and the revolution of 1924-27 was launched.
Okay. Just before we continue on, look, welcome, Clyde. It's recently is showing a lot of interest in what we're doing as well. And
Yes.
welcome. How are you today?
Good. A bit, I guess, harried. I've just been keeping up on the recent events in eastern Ukraine or Donetsk. Yeah, it's been very hectic, and I just got home in a rush. So, thank you for having me in this late. Yeah, I'm caught up with.
We're just currently on. I don't know if you've got a copy or if you.
Oh, I see it. Yeah. I can see where we are. The old three people's principles were revolutionary in the old period. Is that? Yeah, I've got it up. Yep. So yeah, I'm caught up.
So I'll finish this off, and then we'll continue this chapter, and then we'll launch into a discussion.
Great.
Yeah, I was just going to say, comrades, you might want to put yourselves on mute, and just in case of not get any background noise.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I can do that for you if you want. There you go. Oh, you got it. All right. The old three people's principles were revolutionary in the old period and reflected its historical features. But if the old stuff is repeated in the new period after the new Three People's Principles have been established, or alliance with Russia is opposed after the socialist state has been established, or cooperation with the Communist Party is opposed after the Communist Party has come into existence, or the policy of assisting the peasants and workers is opposed after they have awakened and demonstrated their political strength, then that is reactionary and shows ignorance of the times. The period of reaction after 1927 was the result of such ignorance. The old proverb says that whosoever understands the signs of the times is a great man. I hope the followers of Three People's Principles today will bear this in mind. Were the Three People's Principles to fall within the old category, then they would have nothing basically in common with the Communist minimum program, because they would belong to the past and be obsolete. Any sort of Three People's Principles that oppose Russia, the Communist Party, or the peasants and workers are definitely reactionary. They not only have absolutely nothing in common with the Communist minimum program, but are the enemy of communism, and there is no common ground at all. This too, the followers of Three People's Principles should carefully consider. In any case, people with a conscience will never forsake the new Three People's Principles until the task of opposing imperialism and feudalism is basically accomplished. The only ones who do are people like Wang Qingwei. No matter how energetically they push their spurious Three People's Principles which oppose Russia, the Communist Party, and the peasants and workers, there will surely be no lack of people with a conscience and sense of justice who will continue to support Sun Yat-sen's genuine Three People's Principles. Many followers of the genuine Three People's Principles continued the struggle for the Chinese Revolution even after the reaction of 1927. But now that the national enemy has penetrated deep into our territory, we communists will always persevere in long-term cooperation with all true followers of the Three People's Principles, and while rejecting the trades and sworn enemies of communism, will never forsake any of our friends. All right, we'll open up the discussion. You can all unmute yourselves now. I actually just one comment on it. A bit of a lengthy chapter, that one, but I understand what he was trying to say here as well. We're sticking along, but things do change consistently as conditions change too, so we have to adopt. But really, what he's saying, there is no third way. There is, you either for or you're against. I mean, besides the context when in the era this was written, reality is at the end of the day, if any struggle and that, you're either for or against. There is no third position. There is no third way out of it. So it's like I've always heard that there's got to be another way. There's all this third. We're going to find this new way, but where is it? It's never eventuated. People have looked for it and still looking for it, and never come across it. You're either for or you're against. That's when it comes down to the end of the day. It looks like that's what he was giving the ultimatum.
Yeah, I think even though Mao says the People's Three Principles maybe too many times, but it is good a lot of times. I think there's another dimension to it, and that is the concept of united front, of actually different forces coming together, and also that in that there's both cooperation and there's an element of struggle within it. And the question is, that unity is not all about agreeing with and becoming attaching to the coattails of another party. It's actually maintaining your own principled stand and winning that respect over, and building unity on that basis of mutual respect. But also, I think there's the thing which he doesn't quite say here, but I think it indicates in that direction. I mean, there are various class forces involved in building the United Front. And so each have their own set of interests. And while recognising them, that each section, and when he's talking here, the Communist Party has also got an obligation to actually put forward its own position, but seek unity on that basis that it has some principles.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to. There's another quote from Mao that just really seems to be relevant to a lot of what I just read there, because he's talking about the context of unifying the people in order to fight the Japanese. If you're against the Communist Party, in the context of fighting Japanese aggression, then you're effectively on the side of imperialism. It's a quote by Mao from On Contradiction, when he said, when imperialism launches a war of aggression against a country, all its various classes, except for some traitors, can temporarily unite in a national war against imperialism. At such a time, the contradiction between imperialism and the country concerned becomes the principal contradiction, while all the contradictions within the country are temporarily relegated to a secondary and subordinate position. So that a lot of what we just read there reminded me of that particular quote.
Yeah. Clyde, did you want to say anything?
I don't really think I'm that qualified to speak. I'm still a bit unsure about the historical context this was in. It is a bit surprising to me, though. I'd heard that initially, like, China was kept out of the Third International and something to that effect. I must really confess my ignorance on this matter. So please be patient. I'm still learning.
That's all right. Oh, thank you. We all do, but I think the most important, I think Joe's right on showing into contradictions. If we're trying to form united work or front work around that, look, you're either going to be for or against again, and I think that's a good point. Mate. Good point. I do say that was quite wordy. Every time I heard three people's principles, how many times?
Yeah.
All right, we know. And just for the viewers out there, looking at the previous chapter, I think he was talking about the three people's principles of nationalism, democracy, and people's rights.
And socialism.
Yeah. So that's as interpreted by Dr. Sun in 1924. So that's what I think.
Just for Clyde's benefit, the context was the anti-Japanese war at the time.
Yes, the annexation of Manchuria and that. Yes, the Japanese occupation. I'm just a bit, I guess, unsure of the relationship with the Soviet Union at the time. I'm aware of the Sino-Soviet split that I guess came a bit after, but not this period in Soviet-Sino relations.
Yeah, it was interesting because the Comintern at the time was trying. There was a not say friction, but it was obviously they wanted a particular way of doing things, helping organise in China, where Mao actually said no, it's got to be done another particular way, according to the material conditions. China was not like Europe, though they didn't have the industrial development and everything else like say in Europe or elsewhere. This was totally it was a feudal, semi-feudal country, peasant economy, agrarian culture, so agrarian economy, and certainly things had to be different. The industrial working class proletariat was actually a minority, really. So obviously this is where he was portraying the scientific socialism. Well, it's got to be pertaining to the material conditions of then China. You can't sort of just replicate, go bang, all right, now do the exact same here, do the exact game here. We have to study the conditions, the various class forces, who's our friend and who's our foe. And so this is where this is all being written out of that in that context at that time. When they met the reality, 1927, I think that was the split in the Kuomintang. I think the Shanghai Czech that was wanting to hunt the communists out of there. Yeah.
Yeah, that was after Chiang Kai-shek pretended to be a follower of Sun Yat-sen and at the beginning, but it soon turned around. But within the Communist Party itself, if I forgot my names, but if I'm not wrong, they mentioned Wang Qingwei, who was originally, if he's the one I'm thinking of, who was the leader in the 1920s of the Communist Party, or in the leadership. Mao wasn't at that time, or I think it's by the early 30s. The people who in the leadership were basically people who trained in the Soviet Union, and the people in the Soviet Union had the ear to these people, and so that's what they heard. Mao was actually banished to the countryside, which is probably the best thing they did to him at that time. He was, as punishment, he was taken out of the urban centres into the countryside, where he developed the idea of People's War. So by then it had turned around, and the fellow who was the secretary of the Communist Party actually was turfed out. Well, he lost his position. He ended up walking away and joining Chiang Kai-shek
Ah, right,
and became an ardent anti-communist.
right.
Yeah, so
So,
but they were he was a key person that was being listened to in the Soviet Union at the time, but it sorted itself out over time.
all right, cool.
These
But
things do happen.
So this was a period of history where the Chinese Communist Party were fighting the Japanese and the Kuomintang. I know the Kuomintang ended up, I guess, assisting the Japanese. This is that period in history, right?
Well, before there was an attack, Chiang Kai-shek came. I mean, there was I suppose it was later described a bit of a left adventurist uprising in 28 of the Chinese Communist Party. And they got massacred. And at that time, that was also after Chiang Kai-shek had come out and had actually not only politically opposing, but killing communists. They were being dragged out into the street, and there was a bloodbath really at that point. It was bad leadership. It was said after it was bad leadership of the Communist Party as well. And after that period, there was a reorientation in the early 30s, and by the time he wrote this, it came about. It had come about pretty much. So. I mean, we're talking about a political party or a communist party that's made every mistake in the book, and seems, I think history has proved they've learnt a lot from it.
I'd just like to say that I think one of the major differences between Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism as well. So if you put Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism on one side, and you put the history of Marxism like before that on the other side, the big difference really is on the national question, and that's because Marxism in Europe developed in countries that were the empires, that were the imperialist countries that were expropriating wealth from other parts of the world. Especially Britain. I mean, Germany had like a relatively small empire. I mean, but still, these countries, even if they didn't directly control any large enslaved colonial periphery, they still they still produced in exchange for British pounds. And British pounds were backed by wealth that was expropriated and taxed from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And so these countries only had to deal with class as the primary contradiction. They only had to deal with workers versus capitalists. And these workers were living in a situation where their economy was industrializing, which meant that they were fighting for a larger piece of a growing pie. Whereas in the semi-colonies, is like to use Lenin's language, and in the colonies proper, or the extractive colonies, which is what I call them to emphasize the extraction of wealth, as opposed to the settler colonies, which receive wealth. So for example, Australia is a settler colony, India was an extractive colony. The wealth that's extracted from India is used by Britain to invest in Australia. That's like a classic example. But the reason, but in these kind of colonies that are being plundered, the situation is very different because the economy is not growing. The economy is not industrializing. If anything, it's deindustrializing, which is what happened to India over the course of 190 years. And so you can't actually just rely on the working class. There's a very large peasantry, and that peasantry is extremely poor. You can't just write them off by saying, well, they own small plots of land and therefore they have an interest in the institution of private property. Mao understood this, and that's why it's important to apply the science of Marxism, the dialectics and everything to your local conditions, which I think has major implications for here in Australia, because we too are deindustrializing. Now, we're not deindustrializing because we have foreign gunboats and foreign empires oppressing us and extracting wealth from us. I mean, there is a relationship with the United States which is a little bit like that, but it's voluntary. It's not like it's like our ruling class is just unfortunately so corrupt. They're willing to allow it to happen. So,
I do keep in mind that incident where our coal exports were choked out of that trade war with China, but then America ends up taking up the slack for trading coal with China. So that's kind of
well, yeah,
and everything else. You can get into it.
Well, Trump signed the $200 billion trade deal with China after China decided to punish Australia because Australia was pushed forward by the United States to launch this propaganda campaign against China and blame them for COVID and everything instead of having an open investigation, which is what the United Nations was like more generally in favor of. But yeah, I mean, thanks for bringing that up. I mean, recently I was looking at the trade statistics, the current account surpluses that Australia's been running since 2019. And what we're doing with these surpluses is simply to invest in the United States. So, instead of and the Australian Financial Review basically says things like, because America has more investment opportunities. I mean, what nonsense! Australia has like so much natural resource wealth. The idea that we can't invest those surpluses here is completely absurd, and so we end up propping up the US dollar, even though we're not directly subjugated by an empire, and we're not being violently extracted from. It's simply the mindset of thinking that our interests are indistinguishable from the interests of the United States. So I think this is exactly why. Just to finish my point, this is why I think it's very, very important.
Yeah, the
very,
chaos
very important.
In all that, I've came out that the United States, talking about investment opportunities, the United States, given the Ukraine situation, that American companies in particular, but also European companies, guess what they're doing now?
What are they doing?
Selling gas at a markup?
No, they're buying Chinese government bonds.
Oh, right. To lower the current.
Because they're scared. They're scared they're going to lose money. They're going to lose profit, so they're investing their money on Chinese government bonds, and then China's actually getting a windfall of cash to go trading around the world with. So there's a real contradiction in that. But I like to say one of the things is what Joe said before. I think, although at the beginning of the 20th century, most Europe had a fairly big peasantry as well. That was changing fairly quickly, particularly Germany. But still the movement, and we're talking about particularly the first two internationals, they were essentially a European political movement. And they understood European conditions because that's where they were. And it brought home, and one of Mao's big things was that the Chinese must understand Chinese conditions and develop their strategy according to these conditions. And that's a lesson for the world, and that's a lesson for Australia as well. Our starting point is our conditions, not a generalized motherhood statement. Which often people on the left do, that's enough. The slogan will cover everything. It won't. We need to have a detailed, deep understanding of where we are.
Could I just say that I think that the Freedom Convoy in Canada was absolutely amazing when you consider all of these sort of post-industrial Western nations. Their largest sectors are all in logistics because we don't really manufacture, produce anything. That really hit them where it hurts by hitting the logistics chain. And I don't know, modern Marxists, I don't really know where you guys are at, but if you've really looked at, I guess, the importance of truckers, the whole logistics industry in general as being that integral to the bottom line for the capitalists. It's not going to be, manufacturers respect to them and all that, but let's face it, a lot of it's outsourced. I mean, what do you guys think of that? Just more focus on logistics industries.
Well, it's very, very vital. I mean, we've got to see where, the strategic industries, you can call them that way, if you like. The transport is a strategic industry. The one. I mean, what's clearly shown that is the power of people, basically one group of workers, what they can do if they're in a strategic position like the transport sector. They come to if they just stop and put their hands in their pocket, then the whole country comes to halt. Nothing left.
Exactly.
Well, they have.
Yeah, and what and also taking into account is obviously how far we're going to hold the line and move forward as well. What are the strategies around it? They might have to try to change tactics and strategies through it. But that's vitally important. So you raised an interesting point. Yeah,
I mean, yeah, I just think that a lot of people romanticize, what's been done in the past in the same way as, what Mao is saying here is what worked or what they think will work in Europe won't work here. We've got to acknowledge our material reality. Yeah, I kind of wonder, like, what could really, what we've got to work with in these countries where most of the working class are in service roles of some sort, and transportation being a service role as well. Yeah, just something to think
That's
about.
why that's why I raise the money question. Like I always like say that, because this idea that, the revolution in Western countries is going to happen through general strikes or, or like older forms of struggle, I don't think is as valid. Because
Yeah.
if you look at like the United States, I mean, because all of these countries, right? Like not just the United States, but all of the Anglo Empire countries, including Australia, we're all deindustrializing, and the extent to which we're able to have and sustain these first world living standards is largely because of the universal role of the US dollar. Now that has an expiry date, and we have it, the next 10 to 20 years, the US dollar is going to have worsening inflation, and there's going to be all kinds of contradictions. People are going to be calling for higher interest rates, which is going to suck the liquidity out of the economy. It's going to cause unemployment, in order to preserve the value of money. But then the alternative is to just print more money, and that's going to cause inflation and cause asset prices to go up. And so how do we deal with this contradiction? I mean, the problem is that the country that has the world reserve currency um, deindustrializes as a general rule, and that's because these countries are able to print their imports. They're able to just print money, and with that money, they're able to import everything that they need, which then displaces all of their local manufacturing and industry, which is what's happened to the United States. Australia is a little bit different because we're just a resource colony, and so the only industries that really matter to us are the industries that churn out primary commodities, right? Mining
Mining,
and agriculture. I mean,
forestry.
those are our exports, right? Which is why, I mean, the point that I was going to finish on before is that I was making the point that in many European countries that were empires, the only contradiction that was relevant was the class contradiction, because in many ways, talking about national interests was a way in which capitalist ruling classes would justify waging war against other countries, and you just had workers killing workers essentially, which is the World War I situation. But in a situation like where we are today, where Australia is deindustrializing, and part of the reason for the deindustrialization in the United States is the hegemony of the US dollar, then it actually does make sense to talk about the national question. Like in many ways, you can actually make the argument that US dollar hegemony is contrary to the interests of the nation, insofar as it's resulted in significant deindustrialization. So that's the interpretation that I would make. I would say that if the significance of Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism was to introduce to apply the national question to our own conditions.
Yeah.
I'd agree with that.
Yeah.
I think that the only the investigation I've been doing, the only real growth industry, yes, the service industry in general, but I think it's a symptom of not strength and weakness. But so is the big growth industries, finance,
Right.
rise of credit, and it's living on borrowed time, and right at the moment, the last couple of weeks, it's been hidden from public attention, but the Chinese renminbi's been moving up steadily against the American dollar. It's going up. The American dollar is going down at the moment, and we don't know where this will end.
Well, but you just mentioned that the US are buying Chinese treasury bonds, so wouldn't that have something to do with the, US dollar, the value of the US dollar going down compared to the Chinese?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's
It would be. But if the Chinese, they're quite entitled to, start spending that money put it back into circulation in the international economy, the US dollar will go down a lot quicker.
I
To
mean,
what
is that
extent will we do that? We don't know. It's just there'll be oversupply of US dollars. And there already is. That's part of the problem. The problem is you can't live on credit forever because you need to create value to actually pay that off at some point. You just can't go borrowing on debt continuously. And the US has depended on borrowing from debt since the 1950s. And
I'd also,
they can't pay that. It can't be paid. They're trying to squeeze us for it. That's one of the things.
Yeah. Can I add something too? Because when you actually mentioned about value, because this principle still, this saying still does apply that labour creates value. You've got to use value and then you've got labour value, right? And we create, I mean, obviously, and the thing is, what the system we live under now, it's not a policy, it's a system of imperialism where we are dictated to by international finance. Well, it's the rule of international finance and monopoly capitalism, otherwise known as. I would be saying, because a classic case, I'll take it back to 2008 with the subprime mortgages, everything else, and banks and people defaulting, and which led to the bust of the banks. For the simple reason being, we've been deindustrialised. US is deindustrialised. And it's got all these surplus workers, we call surplus labour, all these people, and people cannot afford any more the basic necessities or things that need to be produced to survive. Consequently, that causes the primary still caused a crash, but this time on a supersonic scale, unlike in just one country or a few countries now. And this is what happens. And so, and really what we're seeing is the concentration of wealth coming into fewer and fewer hands. So we call it it's been called the global elite, but the big banks, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, Wall Street, London, all them. And so that, but it's all been concentrated on fewer and fewer hands. So, and where the rest of is poor. And that's what we're seeing under the system. We live under imperialism. It requires most of the world to be poor for them to extract more surplus.
And it's been in even fewer hands.
Can I just finish off by saying, besides, my internet provider seems to be a bit unstable at the moment, so I might be coming and going. But I just want to say, where would Australia be, the Australian economy and our standard of living today, without debt? Just think about that.
Without what, sorry? Without
debt.
debt.
Without debt. Because we're maintaining a standard of living here on debt.
Yeah.
I mean, are you saying that it'd be better or worse? I mean, I think the obvious one would be...
Well, if our debt was suddenly cut off, we'd have trouble eating.
I don't know. It's like, I guess if there were, it wasn't so easy for these bigger companies to sell our resources irresponsibly for pennies on the dollar, and we had more nationalized industries, and we probably might be better. I don't know.
Well, we do need to get off the debt treadmill. We're going to build a future for this country. I mean, the fact is that sooner or later the debt's going to have to be paid. It's a question of who gets to pay it.
Yeah, fair. Oh, on that note, sorry, this is just completely unrelated, but I just saw a story saying that China has forgiven like tens of billions of debt in a bunch of developing countries, just in understanding of all the stuff to do with coronavirus. Did you guys see that one?
No,
I'll chuck it in the... So
in Africa.
I'll get the story up again. I just caught it briefly. Obviously, my attention was more drawn to what was going on in eastern Ukraine. But load. Yeah, cool. I've got the link. I can chuck it in the chat for you guys. But yeah, I thought that was pretty cool. So every time people talk about debt, I don't know. It always seems to me a bit like a scare almost, that that people think that international debt is kind of like Bradstreet and Dunn calling you up or whatever. I don't know how it all works, man. Like this level of finance is a bit beyond me. But yeah, have a look at that one.
Yeah,
But you know,
Well, you
the
put in the
question
private
is,
sector.
like for individuals,
yeah,
nations,
for nations, yeah.
companies, that if you borrow money,
Hmm.
you get to pay it back with a bit of interest thrown on top. The problem is if you put yourself in a position that you're borrowing money to pay the interest,
Hmm.
you can go on for a while,
Hmm.
but sooner or later you're going to have to pay attention to the principal, to
I
the amount you
mean,
borrowed in the first place, because that's going to grow over time.
I've just put the link in the comments section for the general public to look at too. So anyone that comes
Yep.
to views further, they can view that.
Yeah. I
mind you,
suppose
it is.
maybe.
That's all right.
It is a WordPress site, so I don't know how trustworthy it is, but yeah, I mean, it doesn't seems all right. I don't know. Yeah, just
Seems about
do
right.
keep.
Um,
Yeah.
It should be.
There's one extra thing that I wanted to talk about, which is there's
Yeah.
currently a financial revolution happening all over the world, and that's with the digitalization of national currencies globally,
Yes,
and it's actually being led by the third
by
world.
China.
So it's well, I mean, China's like I mean the most advanced of the country. I mean, nobody would think of China these days as third world, but like originally in the original conception of what that word meant, China was certainly a part of the third world or post-colonial world. I think would probably be better. But anyway, that's all besides the point. China has led the fintech revolution in the sense that they've rolled out their digital renminbi, and countries across the post-colonial world are following suit. So Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, Tunisia, Algeria, all these countries are rolling out their own digital currencies.
Uh,
And the problem that this poses for the United States is that it decreases the reliance globally on SWIFT and the Bank of International Settlements. Because if countries around the world can have their own interoperable exchanges, so they can use the internet to transfer money across instead of using the analog phone network of Swift, which is what that essentially is, then that's going to undermine the need for Swift, which therefore is going to have a domino effect
bypass
insofar as it undermines bypasses exactly. It's
sanctions.
going to undermine the need for the sanctions, going to undermine the sanctions. Thank you for
Yeah.
reminding me of that because countries like Iran has been cut off from SWIFT, and we may find out that in like a week's time or something, Russia is going to be cut off from SWIFT.
Yep.
But if countries can digitize their currencies and they can just trade directly,
Yeah.
the other major threat to the US is that countries around the world won't need to hold as many US dollars. Because they can just hold the currencies of the countries they do most of their trade with. Now, if we in Australia held currencies based on the countries that we export to, then we'd be holding, the largest share of currency that we'd be holding would be Chinese renminbi. But instead, we do most of our trade with China in US dollars, and that maintains faith in the US dollar. And so I thought it was very, peculiar that last year in November, the Reserve Bank of Australia put out a paper in which they said there's no need for Australia to have its own Reserve Bank digital currency, and that suggests to me that the interests that govern Australia simply want to keep us hooked onto the old system, and that makes perfect sense if you imagine that Australia is a vassal of the United States.
Which
Well,
it pretty much is.
another country is
Yeah.
moving to
Oops, he's dropped out again.
Oh, Joe's cut.
Joe, you're right, Joe.
Yeah, he's frozen. He must be.
I heard some news recently in Venezuela.
Ah.
They've actually the last few months have had economic growth, given
Right.
the problems that they've got, and part of it is that the trade and relationship with Iran that's been developed. I've got a good idea that at least a portion of that is paid through digital currency. Venezuela's got its own. It's got the petro, which is a digital currency. So that's something that could. I look, the way things are going, Russia, I think probably they'll be pushed along that direction as well. So it creates the possibility that sanctions, the tension, the threats of war may push, within the next few years, the formation of a new bloc. a range
I-
of countries.
Yeah,
And it could be quite a few countries involved.
Yeah.
I
What-
just wanted to add a bit to what Jay was saying about I guess, the crypto, or rather the digital currency revolution. These are just anecdotes, but I know that in African countries, like you mentioned, Nigeria, there are just colloquial sayings along the lines of crypto before women, which, roughly translates to, prioritize your finances before you pursue relationships. But it literally translates into that for them, for a lot of people, in much the same way China skipped a step in terms of their commerce, so they just pay directly with WeChat and everything, whereas the concept of checks and FPOS and all that is novel to them. Yeah, that's kind of how it is in these developing countries. They've skipped many steps ahead and are going straight to crypto or digital currencies. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that national currencies, as they know them, just aren't stable enough to rely on. A lot of people just want, for a lot of countries, crypto, Bitcoin, Ethereum are that much more stable than theirs. And one good example of that is Turkey. The Turkish lira is notoriously volatile. And as a result, you can see on certain websites, they just have a lot of Turkish users because they have like insight token currency that can be redeemed for crypto. I don't know how it entirely works, but there are certain websites that just have higher than normal Turkish populations because they're all trying to just get a bit of crypto here and there because the Turkish lira is not worth their it's just not
Well,
stable
I
for
wanted
them.
to add one thing. I mean, we have to
Yeah.
differentiate between two types of cryptos. There's reserve bank digital currencies, which are created by
Yeah,
states,
by
and there
banks. Yeah,
are yeah, and then you have Bitcoin, Ethereum, Solana, XRP,
yeah,
all of these cryptocurrencies that
yeah.
are like
Yeah, that's why.
originated, decentralized
Yeah,
cryptocurrencies.
that's why I brought up that website, because I'm just trying to, I guess, get the point across that these, because they're not actually crypto or even on the blockchain, as far as I know, they're just tokens pretty much, but they are then redeemed for blockchain crypto, which then, I guess can interface with what you're talking about. These are state-backed state-backed digital currencies.
Yeah. So what the state-backed digital currencies allow countries to do is to control capital movements. The main reason why China banned Bitcoin and has been cracking down
Yeah,
on it ever since it came out is because
for their
it was
own
a
digital
major,
currency.
yeah, but it was also a
Right.
major kind of conduit for capital flight. So China, like in
Yeah.
2015, was just burning through its foreign exchange reserves, simply because what people would do is they would buy cryptocurrency with Chinese renminbi, and then once they have Bitcoin, they can go anywhere in the world and then cash out in US dollars, which then the net effect of that is that there's a massive drawing down of China's foreign exchange reserves, and so that's why they decided to develop the digital renminbi, because that allows them to create a kind of and like a in a sense like an iron curtain, a financial iron curtain around their economy.
Right.
Because what that means is that if you have a Chinese wallet, then you can only send to Chinese wallets. If you try and send to a foreign wallet, then you pay a massive tax. If you buy like
Yeah.
genuinely decentralized cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, then you pay a massive tax, or you're blocked from doing so. That way, the Chinese are able to prevent the
Capital flight.
problem of
Yeah.
capital flight.
That's
That's the
good.
yeah, and this is going to be huge for third world countries, because part
Yeah.
of like the neoliberal system is demanding that post-colonial countries have an open capital account. And the
Of
logic is
course.
that you have to open your capital account so money can come in and money can go out. So if you want to attract foreign investment, then foreign investors have to know that they can pull their money out whenever they want.
Right.
But the problem with that is that the rich in these countries just take their money out of the country. And so
Of
instead of getting
course.
a net inflow of foreign investment, they get a net outflow of capital flight. So since
Right.
1980, the post-colonial world has lost about $16 trillion in capital flight, of which $4 trillion has come from China. And that's all
Fuck.
that bleeding from the post-colonial world is going to stop. There is going to be an expiry date on that because of the development of reserve bank digital currencies.
And it's
Nice.
interesting too. Just on that, what we're seeing too is the coming in being of the new, and going out of being of the old. Though the old style of doing trading in US dollars and all that, it's slowly starting to go out of being. That's why it's becoming more reactive, and that's why we're in these all these conflicts and destabilisations around the world. This is what we're seeing. It's because this is what's happening. It's actually going out of being. Anything that's going, a lot of systems that go out of being, eventually will become more reactive. But what we're seeing is coming into being of something new again. So it's amazing what we're seeing. And when you mentioned there was going to be another block, well, I don't think it'd be a block like when it was during the Cold War period. It'd be a completely different one altogether. Yeah, and I think it's like a lot more of the world will be onto it this time. They're going to trade. The old way of doing everything, being consistently impoverished, in war, famine, destruction, everything is long gone. They want to move on. They want stability. They want to move forward. They want to uplift everyone's population, and this is what's been now the model put forward to the rest of the world. The One Belt, One Road initiative is part of that. The win-win cooperation with everyone out, and the amount of countries that have signed onto it is phenomenal everywhere.
Well,
So,
130 countries are signed on. So that's out of 190 odd countries in the world or nations. And one thing that really is the problem. I think we go down to the basic Marxist economics, which understands that the circulation of capital and the creation of debt only works so as long as that's invested, or enough of it's invested in the creation of value or surplus value, as we say. And that's what's not happening, hasn't been happening for a very long time. That's why debt is a problem, because to pay off debt, the economy has to create value.
I was going to ask you as well, when you're talking about a new bloc emerging, this is something that I was interested in since around the 2010s, back when I think it was Hu Jintao was still president of China. Silva was president of Brazil, and I guess Medvedev was president of Russia. Do you remember the BRICS, that I guess international dialogue? Is there any vestige of that still alive today, which kind of addresses what you're talking about, of like, I guess what this whole conversation's been about, which is a decoupling from the US dollar as the standard for international trade? I mean, as Jay said, it's going to happen most likely by way of state-backed digital currencies. But is there anything or any vestige of the old BRICS in that?
Look, I can't see much, and that's why we get very fluid new sort of economic and political alliances of small groups seems to be coming and going lately. But I mean, one thing that shouldn't be underestimated, the problems Europe and the euro has with the US dollar as well. And there is working together, but there's real tension there as well. And I think it's a recipe for instability. And that also brings problems between nations in Europe itself. So we haven't got a crystal ball. We can't say exactly where it's all going to develop, where it's going to go. But at the moment, the signs are increasingly that a range of countries, not because they're making a calm sort of decision over time, its circumstances are forcing them to do something. If they want to survive economically, they must take measures. And I think that's what drives things.
I mean, I'm all for that. This kind of just seems like I don't know, just like the nature of things, historical materialism, just things will happen as they happen. But I was really just quite optimistic around the time of the BRICS, because it seemed to be of a more conscious effort, less of a response to economic crisis as they emerge. But yeah, what they termed the global south, which I don't know if that's appropriate to say, we're actually all getting together and get in this dialogue of creating a trade through a basket of currencies that wasn't the greenback. And I just was wanting to actually ask Jay about that one, if that anything of the old BRICS is still around.
I haven't really been following BRICS. I mean, BRICS seemed to be more of a thing in the 2000s.
Yeah,
I think
2010s.
the major blow to BRICS has been that Brazil and India used to be ruled by more independent political
Progressive.
formations.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I
Yeah.
wouldn't call the Congress Party progressive. In many ways, they brought neoliberalism to India. But when it comes
Oh,
to
no.
international relations, the Congress Party, especially under the government of Manmohan Singh, was far closer to Russia in particular, and was willing to cooperate with China. I mean, even though India and China have border disputes, which is a zero-sum kind of dispute, and so BRICS Bank was like floated as something that that had the capacity to potentially challenge the IMF. But the problem is that the IMF is capitalized and the World Bank is capitalized by US dollars, which can simply be printed. Whereas the BRICS Bank, if they want to capitalize their lending institutions, then they need to actually earn money from exports. Then they need to actually work for the money that they lend out. Whereas America can simply print money. And so this has always put these alternative lending institutions at
Could
a bit of a
they?
disadvantage. I believe, like the BRICS Bank, in terms of like how much money it has, like its capitalization is about $100 billion, which really isn't much. I don't know what the IMF amount is, but I think it's
It's
significantly higher. It's in
infinite.
like
Yeah.
because
I
it's
guess.
infinite because of the infinite potential
Print.
for the
Yeah.
US to
Print.
just keep printing money. I
Print
mean,
it. Yeah.
inflation is the barrier for the US, and the US has now experienced like highest levels of inflation in 40 years. And I think that's just going to get worse and worse. I think the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is kind of taking up the role of the BRICS Bank, and I think
I.
this is largely because Brazil and India aren't really as devoted to
Sorry.
the BRICS cause as their previous governments were.
Isn't the
Yeah,
SCO or the? Sorry.
I think that was one thing to break up those. I don't know what in meddling there has been to break up that unity around BRICS. But if we look at the Asian thing, we're seeing a kind of, including countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, pulling together and looking for alternatives as well.
Um.
So that's something. And they're countries also with big populations.
I just wanted to say is. Oh,
Well, yeah, sorry.
yeah. Go on.
I
Yeah.
did
Go for
mention
it.
to watch Brazil this year because their elections are, I think, on the 2nd of October this year. So they're
And
going to
Lula's
have the
standing.
president, the general, their state and national elections all around about the same time. So, and there is a big push now to get rid of the Bolsonaro.
Yeah.
And if Lula on the Workers' Party that take power again, it'd be obviously a step forward in the right direction. So, we'll see how they, because there was a lot of lessons learnt hard time around last time around how to did it. So watch this space. I don't know. I haven't got a crystal ball which way this will go. I guess the forces of reaction and imperialism will be out there trying to do everything in their power to stop that. Even though just a progressive government in Brazil.
Yeah, it looks like they're going to. It's pretty set. Bolsonaro's doesn't have much of a base. Even most of his own people don't like him. So,
Well, he's been stabbed twice, hasn't he? Like
yeah, well, politically stabbed. He's gone ever since
Sorry.
They don't get things done in Brazil, don't they?
But he's also been attacking his ministers left, right, and centre. They disagree with him on a little point. He just gets rid of them.
He's
So
he's
they
more or
become
less
enemies.
been talking in interviews saying like he's going to bail. Like he's more or less outlined his plans for flight to America when he loses and he's going to be chucked in jail. So
I think
I'm pretty sure he's gone.
I suspect the risk in Brazil would be better. I don't know how they're going. Would be a military coup.
Maybe.
Watch this space, I think.
Yeah. So, but it may not be able to. Maybe there's too much division on that side because Bolsonaro came originally from the military.
He gives off very strong comprador vibes, basically.
Yeah.
Well, he certainly does, but I'm sure that if he takes off, there'll be a few billion going with him, and that would be, and that's one of the thing. Another country where that happened, the last government is Argentina. I think the cabinet took off, especially the president. He lost with the whole treasury.
Was
They
that
nearly bankrupted the country.
wait? Was that the
They went
previous
off.
government, the Marcy
Yes,
one? Oh yeah.
yes, yes.
I was going to ask you guys, because I know in Argentina right now it's a Kirchner at the helm, and they're like the justicialists, so they're in the same tradition as Peron. What do you guys predict for Argentina? Because I heard that they just took out a massive loan from the IMF, which kind of confused me, considering that the current president is a Kirchner. What's going on? Do you know?
Don't know a great deal because I think
Okay.
in international politics they're moving towards a reasonable position
Fair.
at the moment. But I don't know a lot about the internal. There are some things, and they are in a difficult situation because I said that the previous government nearly bankrupted the country, so the government's got no money, and they need to provide basic services, so they do have to take some fairly desperate measures. But at the moment, the talk is good, but it's a question. The next couple of years will tell what unfolds.
Yeah, some of us, there were some comrades, we kept a close eye on Argentina in the early 2000s. The reason why, when their whole system, when the whole country went bankrupt, they froze everyone's accounts because there was no money. Basically, people lost a lot of incomes that the factories were closing down. But
they're nearly there again.
Yeah, there was a movement of workers moving into the factories again and taking them over and running them up, turning them profitable enterprises again. But so it's basically okay, a workers' co-op, but unlike the generally capitalist system as we know it, they were all coordinating with each other to actually start developing a new economy. And to be perfectly honest, I don't know what's happened. I mean, I think it just sort of stalled. I don't know what. I mean, it may be still continuing, but I'm led.
I've heard.
2005. Think about a quarter of the Argentinian economy was cooperative.
Right.
Yeah, so it wasn't there. Yeah, from what I've heard, there is the beginnings of a resurgence of that.
Yeah,
but I don't know how far it's gone at all. We don't hear much of what's happening there. But as I said, time will tell over the next couple of years. I mean, that's a government that's going to be really watching over its back, but it is in a very vulnerable position.
Yeah, exactly.
I just, I hear about the IMF and I just get a cold chill down my spine. Oh, no, like neoliberal reforms and shock therapy.
Well, over the last few years, the IMF, strangely enough, I still wouldn't trust them as far as I could throw them, but they've made a tilt over the last decade towards Keynesianism and this sort of thing. And we're nice after all. Oh, we've learned from our mistakes and so on.
Is this what I think it is, that they're now rivals with China, now that China are able to give the world a better deal, that the IMF are kind of, trying to compete? Is that what's happening?
Well, it happened before this because it happened at the time of the, what happened in Greece and Spain and other stuff and other countries going to pigs.
Pigs, that shit.
Pigs, an island, of course, we shouldn't leave out. And, there was a threat of countries breaking away from the IMF system.
Yeah,
and so they've had to sort of, turn the face and be a bit more smiley than they were before, and sort of go back to sort of rediscover Keynes. But there hasn't been a fundamental choice. They're just trying to sort of, a friend of mine says.
I think the fundamental difference between
the difference is they use the Vaseline while they screw you over. But
great description, Doug.
So that's that's the situation there. But sometimes countries, if they're forced by the circumstances, even to go because they've got no alternative at the time that they see, to ask for a loan from the IMF, that's no reason to wipe them out. They may have no other choice. Depends on what conditions they apply.
Yep.
But I think what Clyde said before about competition is very, very important because there's a huge difference between the lending practices of China and the lending practices of the IMF. What the IMF typically used to do when they recommended structural adjustment policies in exchange for loans is that they would demand that countries open their capital accounts, like I said before, and then they would loan them money so that they can meet their short-term payments. But then in the long term, these countries would end up being, bled because of capital flight, which would then just be contradictory. They'd find themselves in like a worse debt situation, and then the IMF would just ask for more and more. They'd say reduce government spending, which basically means reduce consumption
Austerity
at like mass
measures,
level,
yeah.
and
Privatize everything.
yeah, and then
Yeah.
liberalize trade so that, I mean, you may have some industries that are not competitive at a global level. We need you to liberalize trade so that they're competing with like, goods from all over the world. Whereas China, in terms of their lending practices, they have a system that I call, or that's been called patient capital, in the sense that they will fund long-term investments, like in which like they'll get a return maybe in like 10 years or something like that, usually to build ports. Now there is like a Chinese strategic angle here. I'm not just saying that China does this out of the benevolence like of its own heart, right? I'm saying that China does this for its own reasons because they need to get resources for themselves. But these countries that they're lending money to, with these like patient loans, in which that they lend for a long period of time, they get ports, they get infrastructure, they get railways, they get all that kind of stuff.
I just chucked the link in. I just tucked the link in the chat to Deborah Bradingham's site, because it's exactly what you said. It's not, China aren't saints, but they have a much more pragmatic model of development and trade and economic engagement in general. And that website, China Africa Real Story by Deborah Bradingham, is very enlightening. I recommend everyone go through that.
Well, that's why
Thanks for
South
that.
America is also doing it. Argentina, I believe, are talking. There's some trade deals in the pipeline. And guess what? Bolsonaro's gone to China. China's become Brazil's biggest trading partner.
Of course.
Even Bolsonaro's go, oh, look, it's not happening with the other lot. So Chile is another country that's developing these kinds of relationships. Obviously Venezuela is. Colombia,
in our immediate region, Indonesia as well.
So's Malaysia.
There's a lot more economic relations with China now than it has been in the past.
Well, they're both in the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah. Yes, they are.
As well as the other countries. And that's going to do that because the Road and Belt Initiative is about developing trading infrastructure, which includes shipping, rail, other, the rest of it, high tech. And this will flow through. At the end, China gets the benefit because it gets trading relations. But it's also seen in our country as saying, well, it gives us a benefit because the other lot haven't helped us.
No.
And, Pacific Islands even are moving in that direction. So, they've joined the Belt and Road. Victoria was going to. Dan Andrews was trying to get in, but
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah, it was that awful Senator Kitching, who's just like has the absolute worst positions, but she was like vehemently opposed to that. What's wrong with her? So I'll just give you a brief. Like Daniel, I think it was more like a memorandum of understanding about the Belt and Road, but it was the step forward. I think it was about 2020, 2021. The federal government put in legislation to basically give itself powers to review any trade agreements or trade deals and stuff, mainly to tell the states to pull in the line for Australian interests, right? So it went for review after it was all legislated, and basically also Peter Dutton led the charge on that, who's now the Defence Minister, a very sinister person. He basically, and they just reviewed it and tore it up, basically told nothing, it's void, it doesn't meet certain criteria for Australian national interest, which they didn't have an outline, but basically it was just out of vindictiveness and spite, getting the orders from Washington to the federal government. You must go on the, be our lapdog and do as you're told and tell China off on everything.
Yeah, look, there's this hoo-ha there's been about the Chinese taking over the port in Darwin. And if we look at the history of that, what that's really all about, well, if we look at any ports, particularly these days, any ports around Australia, shipping lines basically, they lease facilities, port facilities. All of them do. So if you're involved in shipping, you have to, for instance, you have to borrow some space in somebody else's terminal, and you wait
Yep.
out in the sea, anchored out in the sea for as long as it takes till they get their ships through, and that's very costly. When you consider the northern end, the most of the shipping is iron ore and has been coal up to now
Yeah, Port
going to
Hedland's the
China.
biggest bulk carrier
That
port in Australia.
it was a big burden on China not to have a terminal where it has priority, where its ships have priority.
Yeah.
Because to have a ship held out, waiting out in the bay somewhere, even for a day, you're talking thousands of dollars cost every day for one ship.
Yeah.
Imagine a whole fleet of ships
Yeah.
that
And
they're having
just
to
on
go.
the,
They have to wait a week or 2 weeks out.
yeah,
And
just-
now Australia no longer has its own shipping line.
that's
They're
right.
all foreign shipping lines that lease every port facility around the country. But an exception is made of China having one to actually get iron ore and coal out quickly, and no
And-
mention made of the others.
I actually got a couple of points here to raise. It was also too because when I was organising in the Pilbara, I mean, obviously Port Hedland was on the stops, and as I said, it's the largest bulk carrier port in all of Australia. It's massive. I've seen the iron ore bulk carriers that come in; they're huge. And what you could see from the eyes, then I counted one day there was about 25 ships offshore, just waiting to be coming into harbour. I mean, it takes time to load a ship because under shipping, where they make the money is once the ship's loaded and it's left port, ready to go to the next port to float to deliver the goods. So that's one thing. And so they're sitting there, and of course, the waiting time, ships come in, you've got a time you're going to have the pilot sent out there on the helicopter because it's the pilot then takes over, man, the ship brings the ship in, and vice versa. There's a lot of work to bring in a big ship like that. So you can see that. The other point, and also I too want to raise when you mentioned about we did have our own stevedoring line, shipping line was called an Australian National Line, ANL, and it was Paul Keating when he was Prime Minister, a Labor Prime Minister, that actually sold it off. It was when the ANL was originally created, our own shipping line. It was guaranteed that we got security of our own shipping because we're an island, we're a continental island. We think about it. That we are so dependent on shipping, but now we're at the mercy of multinationals who own our shipping lines, and that we've got very little shipping left. We've got some coastal shipping, but even that still is a push to actually have that all foreign owned, and that means too that stopped the ability to have our own seafarers employed, and that it'll all be managed by foreign crews and stuff, which are heavily exploited. And what you'll find on a lot of these ships, you'll have a Filipino crew. Their conditions on there are pretty horrible. You'll have a midsection of, say, engineers from all over the world, and then you have and then you have a European type, a captain, high officers and stuff who want to get paid. And then usually the shipping companies, they register these ships in all these what we call the third world nations. Panama is a classic case. The tax havens, Panama or wherever, you'll see it. And obviously, these ships are actually not up to standard. A lot of them are just rusting hulks, and they can actually. I'm not trying to get too far off, but something happens. You've got the Great Barrier Reef. It's a very delicate ecosystem. If something happens to one of those ships, they break up. You can just imagine the mess and the pollution and environmental catastrophe that happens, crashes everywhere. So there's no regulation or nothing. And God knows what's in it. They're bringing in all sorts of pests and they put in the bilge water a whole lot. So when it was all ANL, at least it was regulated. We had good quality ships there, worked all the time. There was a high standard. But once oh no, Wouldn't regard to who was in government, Labor or Liberal, same old dribble. There would have been a whole neoliberal. No, we've got to open everything up, privatise everything, deregulate everything, and this is the situation we're in. So when we're talking about ports and stuff, well, then the property question must be raised, and also which classes we're actually benefiting from. So people complain about the port of Darwin. Well, look at all our ports. Who owns them? It's look at all of them. Just don't look at one port. We should look at everything. Who owns our national lines now? Who owns this and that? I mean, our stevedoring is all owned by private firms from overseas. From I think who owns DP Ports? It used to be. I believe it was Saudi Arabia, wasn't it? Or UAE.
Don't know who does these days.
Patrick's is owned by private. What happened to Australian National Line, our own stevedoring?
Yeah.
When we had that. So
it doesn't exist.
Doesn't exist. So there it is.
Lord.
Look, I think we've gone pretty much longer than not. We usually go about an hour and a half at the very most. We only have 5 minutes left, so I think we'll probably start calling it in. But look, that was a great discussion. I thought we'll get through these couple of chapters, talk about this one. It's been a brilliant discussion, comrades. That's fantastic.
I think it's a good point because the next chapters talk about culture, and the role of culture, and that's another really huge topic that really, and probably one even less understood around the place.
Well, comrades, you got anything else you might want to add before we finish up tonight?
Oh man, I'm just hoping I didn't make an absolute fool of myself this time.
No, you didn't. Fantastic.
Yeah,
just ask questions anytime.
Yeah, I do appreciate that you've had the patience for me. I'm clearly just finding my way around, and I'm very humbled to be around you all. You're very well-read people. I'm glad to be learning.
Try not to be too humble, but
I mean, I'm just reading the room. I know that this is something I've not focused on, not really thought about as much as you guys. It's just, as these contradictions of our current system come to a head, obviously everything is that much more apparent or prescient. So, I'm coming around to it all just because it's, everything's indicating it was all true. So,
And it takes all of us time to figure out what's going on around the place. One, I suppose it's an obvious truism, but it still needs to be repeated. None of us know everything, and we're always trying to learn. Well, hopefully we're always trying to learn. And the reason why we're here at the moment is precisely because we've got to work the future out together. And that's the point. Nobody's going to tell us what to do. There's no instruction manual out there.
Yeah, well, like Ma's saying, you just got to consider the material reality of your country, your place, and work with it, and don't go by anyone else's playbook.
That's right.
And I think that plays up because there is, so far a lot has been about the material reality, and so on, and how different forces react to it. But there's also a subjective reality, which is related to it, and the question of culture does come into it. So we need to not only understand, the big picture of which class is in which position, and strata within it, but we've got to understand how are people responding to these situations today.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Aspirations?
Sorry, I'm just going to say I've had the. Oh, yep. Sorry.
That's all right. Keep going.
I've just had the misfortune of getting caught up in discussions with some people in your circles, and especially old mate Dust James, and he's great. I love him. I love everything he's about. But all of the people around him just have the worst takes, and I find myself getting involved in the most dogged arguments with these people, and typically getting Facebook banned for it.
They're learning.
But how do you reach these people? That's I'm very curious to know what Matt has to say on the culture of New Democracy, because it's a cultural question that I'd really like to get at. There's just some people that they're just not there. I don't know. Or I don't know. I don't know
Yeah,
how to reach
I
people.
think it's all too easy for people and organisations. I won't put it
Yeah.
out to develop a very subjective. The developers set of holy cows, as they used to say, where
Yeah.
in a sense they almost become points of religious fervour. You
Yeah.
can't deviate from, even a syllable, and
Mm.
and everything's any sort of working out anything and examining things is thrown out as soon as you cross that. It's very
Mm.
difficult. It's just patience, and I think it's the best people work it out eventually. They're caught up in some of that, uh,
Mm.
but I think it's a question of not really slanging them for it.
Mm.
Uh,
I get.
and I think that we can all learn,
Yeah.
including
Well,
them.
we're going to have to sort of wind up. It's 8:30.
Yeah.
Jay,
Sorry about
you
that.
want to add anything before we go as well?
No, I've said my piece.
Yeah. All right. Well,
Yeah,
no, look, thank you once again. Actually, guys, can you actually stay on the line when we finish the broadcast? We'll just have an informal chat.
what was
Sure.
that?
Well, actually, one thing that's raised out of a very
Informal
important,
chat.
like, God, I'll just talk about what we're going to do next shows and
Yep.
stuff, and obviously next
Mm.
couple of weeks. Just what I was saying is, what actually were interesting points coming out. Marxism or scientific socialism, whatever you want to call it, it's not a dogma. It's a guide to action. That's what it is,
Mm.
and that's what it is. We've
Yes.
got to be careful. It's not a dogma. It's flexible. It's used for, like you correctly pointed out, Clyde, to our own respective conditions of our own countries. And actually, we're studying a male. That's what he did.
Mm.
So,
Well, that's
keeping
the
that.
reason. Yeah,
Yeah, that's the
that's
reason. Yeah. So that's the reason why we're studying it. Well, look, thank you again, comrades and friends and fellow workers out there. And anyone who will be viewing this in the future, a big shout out to you all. Well, once again, look, I'll ask people to like the channel. Please share it far and wide. Also, be aware too. Please go to Australians for New Democracy YouTube channel as well. We will be doing a live. I think I forget what it was, sometime in March. So yeah, we will be keeping a view on that as well. Well, thank you once again, and I'll round it off as that workers of all countries unite. Well done.
Yeah.
Nothing to lose but your chains.
Exactly. Thank you, comrades.